believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo Rendas, also known as Ricky France, and a great episode for you today. Today we have a topic I haven't hit a lot on, but I'm very excited about doing a deep dive into the Anunnaki, ancient civilizations, the origin of man, suppressed knowledge and history and technology, and much, much more. So this will be a fun discussion. And today, my guest is Andrew Collins. He's a journalist, he's a best-selling author, and all-around very fascinating guest. But before we get into this fascinating conversation, let me remind you this is a value for value show. If you get any value out of the discussions and guests I bring to you, please consider giving some value back. And of course, it doesn't have to be financial. You can share the show, tell people about the show, post the show anywhere you would like, clip the show, review and subscribe to the show on all the platforms you listen to and watch the Ripple Effect podcast. But if you can't financially support the show, there's tons of ways you can do so. You can join our Patreon page, and thank everyone who has. I truly, truly appreciate everyone who donates a little bit every month. If a small percentage of people who watch and listen to the Ripple Effect podcast donated as little as $1 a month, I could easily do the show full time. So that puts in perspective how little everyone has to donate to really make an impact and make this show a full-time gig. And then, of course, you can send a one-time donation via Venmo, PayPal, or send crypto. And you can also check out our merch store. You can go directly to our merch store by going to the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com. And hoodie season is right around the corner. So if you need a new hoodie or you're looking to get some Christmas presents, check out the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com. Check out the new logos and new designs, and hopefully you can find something you like. The merch store is run by Ryan Graham, who is a friend of the show, the host and creator of the Independent Review podcast, and also the owner of Big Frog Merchandise. So you're helping a fellow podcaster, a fellow small business owner, and if you ever bought any merchandise from Big Frog Merch, you'll know that their quality is second to none. Their print is phenomenal. The detail on the clothes and merchandise is amazing. So I can't thank Ryan enough for running my merch store and also for giving me such awesome products to share with my audience. You can find all these links and much more at the rippleeffectpodcast.com. Also go to theunionoftheunwanted.com and check out my other show I co-host with Sam Tripoli from the Tinfoil Hat Podcast, Charlie Robinson from Macroaggressions, and Midnight Mike from the OBDM Show. It's a roundtable discussion show. We bring in tons of thinkers, authors, researchers, podcasters, journalists, and many more different types of people. And we have a roundtable discussion. So if that's something that you think you'd be into and you would enjoy, check out theunionoftheunwanted.com. The audio is available everywhere you can get audio podcasts, and the video is available on Rumble. But go to theunionoftheunwanted.com to find all those links. Thanks, guys. Enjoy this amazing conversation with author, journalist, historian, Andrew Collins. Peace.
Who am I? My name's Andrew Collins. I really got into this subject, I suppose, like an awful lot of people, by reading books by Eric von Daniken back in for me, the late 70s. And also books by inspirational people like John Michel, books like The View Over Atlantis. You know, he was the inspiration for the Earth Mysteries subject, you know, like looking into stone circles and ley lines and sacred geometry and alignments across the landscape, stuff like that, and how, you know, quite clearly there was some kind of lost civilization here, or certainly a lost technology and a lost understanding of the past. So I think that's really what got me into it. I mean, you know, a lot of my early books were what I call sort of mad books, basically, on what we call psychic questing, which is going into the landscape, interacting with spirits, finding artifacts, dealing with black magic and all sorts of stuff like that. Books like The Black Alchemist, The Seventh Sword, The Second Coming, and various other ones. And they were great fun. They sold, a lot of books. They're all true stories. But then I suppose it was in the early to mid 90s that I sort of transitioned into more serious work. And I think one of the keys was reading the book, The Orion Mystery by Robert Bufal. I mean, he's a friend of mine now, but I didn't know him at the time. And, he sort of came up with a brand new vision of ancient Egyptian creation myths and how they related to the stars. And, obviously for him in particular, the constellation of Orion. And although I didn't necessarily agree with everything that he wrote, what it told me was that people who were non-academics like me, whose background is really journalism, can write books on serious subjects like, ancient history, and particularly in one where you would assume you had to be an academic or a scholar to do so. But no, you could do it if you just had a very good idea and you did all of the background research, you did all of your references, the bibliographies, etc., etc. So I wrote a book called From the Ashes of Angels, which was published in 1996. And what this showed was that the memory of what in Hebrew legend are known as the Watchers, a type of sort of, flesh and blood like angels that were able to mix with mortal women who had babies called Nephilim, and these women, that they would give them the rudiments of civilization, all the everything that they needed to create the cradle of civilization. Those plus similar stories that were coming from Sumeria on the so-called Anunnaki, that were also said to be the builder gods. In other words, that they helped humanity create the first cities. They gave us irrigation. They gave us agriculture. They gave us animal husbandry. That these and very similar myths from the Near East and Middle East were a memory of prime movers or some kind of shamanic elite, particularly associated with birdmen, shamans wearing cloaks of feathers. All the indications coming out were that, these were flesh and blood shamans, some kind of elite group that came into the area of Eastern Anatolia, modern day Turkey, and triggered something off, which we'd call in archaeology the Neolithic Revolution. And that, all of this had occurred somewhere in the area of Eastern Turkey, probably between Lake Van and the area of Şanlıurfa, the ancient city of Edessa, which we'll talk about. Now, this book was a bestseller. I think it got something like number 26 in the Times bestseller list, which is, all books, which is incredible. And what I didn't know is that as I was writing this, the first spades were going into the ground at a place that we're all now familiar with, and that's Göbekli Tepe. And they kept the secret for 4 years. And then they published a huge colour article on the subject in a German magazine, because German archaeologists were involved in this discovery. And when I saw this, I thought, oh, well, there you go. There's your mother lode. There is your smoking gun of, certainly a lost technology. Some would call it a lost civilization. And so, of course, I wanted to go, to this place called Göbekli Tepe, which I was finally able to do 4 years later in 2004, after my book was published in Turkey. Something that would seriously come back and bite me eventually. And the book would eventually be banned, basically as an accessory to terrorism, because of its content, which went into the history, the cultures, the traditions of the Kurdish people. And unfortunately also dedicated it to the Kurdish people. And I mean, it's a little bit like like writing a book on the history of China and dedicating it to the Free Tibet movement. I mean, it's not going to go down well, and it's going to come back and bite you one day. But at the time, I went out to Turkey, and I was able to go to Göbekli Tepe. And whilst I was at this ancient ruins of a city called Haran, very, very important place in the same area, these kids came up and sold me a little book, little booklet, like a guidebook on the local area. And in the back, it just had this picture of a T pillar. Now, these T pillars are something that define this high culture. That the best example is Göbekli Tepe, but this was somewhere else. I mean, this was laying down. Clearly, it was where it was found. It had this snake crawling up the front narrow edge of it. And it said that it was at a place called Karahan Tepe. And I thought, I need to find this place. But it said that it was in a remote region called the Tek Tek Mountains, which is about 25 miles from Göbekli Tepe. So a couple of days later, I was there with the car, the driver, the interpreter. And we spent hours trying to find this place. So just nobody knew where the hell it was. Until finally we spoke to a guy in Arab dress on a tractor, and he sort of pointed in a direction. So we went in that direction, and then eventually we reached the farmhouse, and the little boy came out, and the interpreter spoke to him, and he just pointed to this limestone hill towards the south, and seemingly, this was Karahan Tepe. So we walked towards that, and I started to see stone tools, worked stone flint tools on the ground. That's obviously a good sign of ancient human activity. And as I got closer and closer, these stone tools got more and more and more until there were hundreds of them everywhere. And I also started seeing all around the base of the hill and going up the side of the hill, the what you quite clearly see were the tops of these T-pillars. Like, as I said, you find within the stone circles at Göbekli Tepe, they're all usually in spokes of a wheel with two huge, great monoliths in the center. And so I realized that there was a lot just beneath the surface here. There was also a lot of right-angled fragments of what are known as porthole stones. Now, these are either entrances into, lost enclosures from the side, or something they go down from the top. And I mean, they were so beautifully carved. They looked like they were something from a medieval building, medieval Gothic building. It was incredible. This and other indications told me that a hell of a lot had gone on here in the past. And so over the next 15 odd years, I would go back to the site and explore every part of it. I mean, there are actually two hills at Karahan. There's a southern hill, which is the one we're talking about. There's a northern hill that seems to act as almost like a sort of a site for astronomical observatory. And it also contains various caves, which, I think were used by this ancient culture that lived as much as 11,000 years ago. And then, as I say, I went there in 2018, and I heard that they were about to survey the site to finally do excavations. And the following year they began, although everything went quiet, didn't hear anything from it. We didn't go out there. And of course, obviously, the lockdowns prevented any kind of, return visits on the tours that we do out there. And then in 2021, about September, they released details of what they discovered, and they showed that they'd uncovered this vast area of these interconnected enclosures, some of them cut completely out of the bedrock. And I mean, I've described this as a lost city of the Anunnaki. I mean, it's 11,000 years old. It's incredibly sophisticated. We'll talk about some of the enclosures, but they're still working on it now. In fact, I've just heard today that they've uncovered some bowls there made of lime mortar, which is something called terrazzo. This is the first ever time ever. I mean, these are geopolymer basically, and they've been found at the site. And this is even before pottery. So you have these weird, lime and limestone geopolymer bowls that have been found there. I mean, this is just I just heard this from my colleague Hugh Newman just a couple of hours ago, because there's been a huge Neolithic Congress at Llanllwrfa, which is the main city of the area, and a lot of revelations were coming out. So, it's a time of discovery. Lots of things happening, and we'll take it on to the next stage in a moment.
Yeah, I feel like these topics are becoming more and more interesting to the average person because I think what it does, it ties in so many other interesting topics like the origin of man, spirituality, a lot of these religious texts or these, old civilizations, some of the stories that are told and retold, like we're starting to uncover what they could have been referencing and other things like that. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. And I also think your background, which is similar to Graham Hancock's, right? Like a journalist who kind of got into this field, I think it actually benefits you, right? Because you didn't get into the field by accepting a dogma or a already accepted worldview, right? Do you think that actually worked in your favor?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Graham Hancock is the sort of, you know, the leader of this movement, if you like. I mean, he's obviously got two series of Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix. They've been incredibly popular. And suddenly this subject is a part of pop culture. I mean, in the same way that, Star Wars or, Doctor Who or Star Trek or anything like that is, it's being discussed by the same influencers on YouTube. And it's a side to fight for as well, because obviously on the one side you have these orthodox archaeologists, people like Flint Dibble, who, Graham Hancock has had this huge, two-way debate with on Joe Rogan recently. And he represents orthodoxy. He represents, we know everything, we don't want change. And what you're doing is, not only bunkum and pseudoscience, but because you're doing it, you're obviously racist, you're obviously a white supremacist for doing it. And on the other hand, you've got the people that are watching Ancient Apocalypse or watching shows like your own or other similar ones from other influencers on YouTube and saying, no, there is something here. There is a lost piece of, human history, which we need to understand. And, I mean, there are different ways of looking at it, of course. I mean, some people want to go down the space aliens route. Some people want to go down the Atlantis route. My area is looking towards our distant cousins of humanity, like the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, and try to understand, what gift they gave humanity, what legacy did they allow us to carry forward to create the technologies and the innovation that led to the creation of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. I think it was a lot, and I mean, hopefully we can get into that.
Yeah, what are some of those things that, we can expand on?
Well, I mean, let's look at Karahan Tepe. I mean, one of the enclosures, which we call the Pillars Shrine, it's structure AB, is actually cut out of the bedrock. I mean, there's like level bedrock at the base of the hill, and they've dropped down the bedrock to create this huge structure, out of which you have 10 bedrock pillars. So they pillars that, as they've been chipping away to get down to it, they've left in place. So you have these 10 beautiful pillars. They brought an 11th one in and put it into a slot. And on the west wall, facing onto the hill itself, is this giant human head. I mean, it's about 3 times the size of a normal human head, and it's on the end of a long serpentine neck. I mean, it's like something out of Beetlejuice, basically. I mean, it truly is. And everywhere you've got carvings of snakes everywhere, right? They're carved on benches, they're carved on the sides of stones, they're incised, and I mean, it's quite clear that the snake was really, really important there. Not the only symbol, but one of the most important ones. So you have to say to yourself, well, what's going on here? What might have been taking place here 11,000 years ago? Well, as I was first looking at the overhead plan of Karahan Tepe, this was in sort of September, October 2021, I noticed that there were three interconnected shrines. One we call the Great Ellipse, which is this huge elliptical enclosure that seems to have very specific geometry. The second one is the Pillar Shrine, which we'll come back to. And then the third one is what we call the Pit Shrine. And it's bizarre because it's a shrine, but it's got this huge like dip in the middle, like a small swimming pool within it. I mean, it goes down about 8 feet, and there's no obvious way of getting down into it. So, either it's full of water, or that it was a snake pit, or some kind of, ritual enclosure for people to go down into an altered state or whatever. But what I noticed about this last one is that it was right at the end of the hill, and it faced towards the northwest. And I started fiddling around with Google Earth and various other things, and looking at it and looking at this plan. And I worked with an engineer friend of mine called Rodney Hale, and we both concluded that it was orientated towards sunset at the time of the summer solstice. Now, this is really interesting because it would make it arguably one of the oldest, aligned buildings in the world. But using this sky program called Stellarium, you can just click forward and see what would happen when it got dark. And exactly at the same place where the sun had set, just 2 hours later, the Milky Way would have been perfectly vertical on the horizon at exactly the same spot. Remember, this is the solstice, so this is a really important day of the year. But in the middle of the Milky Way, you've got what's known as the dark rift that starts at the spot on the horizon where you're looking at it, and it goes up to the stars of this constellation and known as Cygnus, which is a sky figure always generally shown as a celestial bird. It's a vulture in the Near East and Anatolia. But what's right on the horizon, so right in line with you, is what's known as the galactic bulge, the very center of the Milky Way galaxy. And around it, you have constellations of Sagittarius, Ophiuchus, which is known as the 13th sign of the zodiac, and the stars of Scorpius, which, although we know as a scorpion, is actually a snake. Ophiuchus is holding this big snake, according as a sky figure called Serpens. And I thought, these people are clearly into a sky snake of some kind of celestial snake, because they seem to be focusing on that area of the sky. Is it possible that as far back as 11,000 years ago they were into some kind of cosmic snake? Well, I started looking and I realized that universally around the world there was a concept that the Milky Way itself represented a snake, a serpent. It was known as the world encircling serpent or snake. And its head was the galactic bulge. And here was an example, I thought, of what was going on, as far as back as 9,000 BC, but even more significant is that the Pillar Shrine next to this other one, my good friend and colleagues, Hugh Newman and J.J. Ainsworth, actually, based on me having made this discovery, went to Karahan just a couple of months later at midwinter, not midsummer, midwinter to 2021. And they were there taking photographs. It was just after dawn. And they saw a beam of light come right across the Great Ellipse, come through this tiny porthole and hit this giant stone head. And it moved across it like a dagger of light for about 40 minutes and then just stops. And we know that 11,000 years ago, the sun was slightly lower down, so it would have hit it even better. Plus, we know that there was almost certainly a roof on this little enclosure. So it would have been a spectacular sight just after sunrise at the time of the winter solstice. Again, I mean, arguably the oldest type of alignment like this in the world. I mean, it's similar to what you get at Stonehenge. It's similar to what you get at the passage grave of Newgrange in Ireland. That happens at midwinter as well. The sun pierces this long corridor, comes into the center of chamber and illuminates all these beautiful spirals and symbols. But here it was, 11,000 years ago. So not only were these people synchronizing their structures to the celestial movement of the sun, and probably the moon, but also the stars, but also the Milky Way, and that they were locking their mechanism into the idea of some kind of cosmic snake, something that becomes universal eventually around the world. I mean, in North America, it's in Central America, South America, it's there in Vedic tradition in India, it's there in Akkadian tradition in Mesopotamia, it's there in Eastern Anatolia amongst the indigenous religion called the Yazidi. So, it looks like all these ideas go back much further than what we ever thought possible. So this is the sort of stuff that's on offer from a place like Karahantapai.
Now, when you go to these places, I've never been to one of these. Like, I was born in Portugal, so I've been around castles and stuff like that. But
Yeah,
you're talking about places that had possibly civilizations that were much older. Is there a energy or a feeling or a sense? Is there something? Because I've had Rupert Sheldrake on in the past, and his morphic resonance theory, and
yeah.
I tend to believe that there is energy, or maybe things have memory. There's something that we sometimes sense and feel, but we can't really explain or understand. Do you ever get those feelings when in these ancient areas?
Yeah, of course. I mean, firstly, you have to differentiate between any kind of spiritual beliefs and scientific beliefs. I mean, in a spiritual sense, we can all feel energy or a presence, when we go to particular sites. Um, this is a subjective feeling, but based on something that's we presume is going on there. If we're looking at it from a scientific point of view, you have in the landscape all over the planet geomagnetic fields, and these are at different strengths all over the place. Sometimes you even get geomagnetic anomalies, which can, create very intense electromagnetic fields. Um, and quite clearly, our bodies pick these up. Also, if you build something in a landscape, it's going to affect those inherent geomagnetic fields. And the ancient peoples of East Asia realized this and created a whole system to work with it called Feng Shui. And today Feng Shui is, where to put your furniture in the room, but it didn't start off like that, I promise. Because basically what it was is if you accept that you have these energies flowing through the landscape, which they referred to as chi energy or ki energy, then you had to live in harmony with it. So if you were going to build a building, you had to build it in the direction that that energy would flow through and then out the other side. So, the doors, the windows would have to be orientated correctly. So what you would do is you'd get a Feng Shui master to come round and say, right, which way should we do it? Which angle, which alignment? So he'd obviously look at all of the local landscape. He'd look at the hills, the rivers, everything. He would then use this instrument, which would actually move based on the geomagnetic energies. And so he'd give you instructions on how to do this. And the importance about this is that if you did it right, then you'd have good harmony, good luck in the family, you'd have good health. But if you ignored that advice or did not consult a Feng Shui master in the first place and you built it completely wrong so that the energies just crashed into the side of your house, then you could expect bad luck, ill health, bad commerce or stuff like this. This was what was believed. And let's assume at least some of this is correct and some kind of, reality. So that gives you an example of, how we might feel if we go to somewhere like a stone circle in Britain, or you might go over, in America to a medicine wheel, or a sacred place like Chaco Canyon, or one of the incredible earthworks that you have in North America, like, Great Circle in Ohio or something like this, or Cahokia. There's an energy connected with these sites, and if you're sensitive enough, you will feel them.
Now, Tesla, and I've repeated this quote many of times on the show, he talked about how if you wanted to understand the universe, you had to understand energy, frequency, and vibration. How much of that do you think maybe that understanding of frequency, vibration, energy was maybe some lost knowledge that was used to maybe create some of these lost civilization, caves and these sculptures and all these things that were made that we don't really have a understanding on how they were made. Do you think there's some lost knowledge, or do you think that maybe it's suppressed knowledge, right? Because sometimes I go back and forth with like, hey, maybe some of this information is out there, maybe somebody is aware of it and it's being suppressed, or is it really just us being a little bit just arrogant that our current understanding of the universe, it surpasses their understanding, past civilization's understanding of the universe.
Well, I mean, starting with Tesla, obviously, I mean, he was somebody that truly understood, the geomagnetic fields of the Earth, and how this could be utilized. And what he wanted to do was to create a system of free electricity, using it, utilizing it, by sending pulses through the ground itself that could use almost like a sort of nodal system, that existed naturally to quite literally, instead of using cables, but to flow that energy through the ground itself, and then to come out, obviously to create power stations, obviously to light people's houses, like light bulbs, etc., etc. And it can be done. There's no question that that can be done. Unfortunately, other forces got in the way and said, well, look, this would be free. We're not going to make any money here. So the whole thing was suppressed, and it was suppressed. No question about that. And we know that eventually, Tesla, for all of his incredible inventions, essentially died penniless, really. So that's a lesson of history. As far as we're concerned, I think it's a case of more of, we have an understanding which most of the other people around us don't. In other words, we understand that there are subtle energies. We understand that the ancients must have been aware of them. So how can we bring this to the fore? How can we set it down in writing? How can we use it within science today? So we are the lucky ones by knowing that all of this is real. And I mean, my first introduction to it was through the works of people like John Michel. I mean, he did an incredible book that people should check out called The View Over Atlantis. I mean, I can't remember. I think it came out in 1968 originally, but it's just mind blowing, and he shows that the ancients were aware of these subtle energies of the earth and marked them with their monuments, whether it be stone circles, dolmens, medicine wheels, temples, of course, but that within them, to enhance that energy, that connection, they use sacred geometry. In other words, very specific dimensions, proportions, relationships between these that would enhance that natural energy. I mean, if you look at somewhere like Göbekli Tepe and also Karahan Tepe, the enclosures have very specific whole number geometry. Many of the structures at Göbekli Tepe have a 3:4 ratio, whether they be elliptical in shape or rectangular in shape. Now, why is that important? Because a 3:4 ratio is what you need to carry the voice for optimizing acoustics. And even to this day, there are references in standard textbooks that say, if you're going to create something like a theatre, you need to use 3:4 whole number ratios in the design. So these people 11,000 years ago were aware of that, and we originally thought that all of this type of knowledge probably began with the beginning of the megalithic culture in Britain and Europe about 3,000 to 4,000 BC. But we now know that all of this was happening much, much earlier, as much as 11, even 12,000 years ago, to Göbekli Tepe and Karahan and other similar sites in that area. I mean, these are not in isolation, by the way. I mean, there's at least 12 of what the archaeologists today refer to as Tash Tepelah sites. Now, this is an interesting term. What it means is Tash means stone, basically, or stony. And it relates to the fact that these people were quite clearly working in stone, particularly creating all of these T-pillars with the beautiful animals. Some of them are anthropomorphic with arms and hands and hems of garments and belts. And the actual T heads are actually the abstract heads of probably divine ancestors or, celestial beings or something like that. And Tepala basically means tepes. Tepes is the name they give to the occupational mounds that can be anything up to sort of 300 yards by 200 yards across and maybe 50 to 100 feet tall. That these people built all of their monuments. They would start by building them on the bedrock, and when they got decommissioned, they would be filled up and they would cover them over and then build something on top of that, build something on top of that, build something on top of that. And this would go on for multiple generations, through from the Neolithic into the Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, all the way down to Roman times. And there are hundreds of these tepes in southeastern Turkey, many of which are still unexcavated. So, God knows what we're going to find in them in the future.
Now, on the topic of them still uncovering stuff and the fact that, I was kind of talking about maybe suppressed information or some suppressed piece to the puzzle of the origin of man. There is some sites where there's a lack of access to them, right? Do you think most of it is just basically they don't want people tampering with it or messing anything up? Or do you think that in some cases they could be hiding something?
I think it's probably a bit of both, in all honesty. I mean, what we have increasingly seen, particularly since the lockdowns, is that places where you're allowed to go at sites are being, fenced off, or, quite clearly cameras telling you not, sort of focusing down to make sure that you don't go close. I mean, this is in Turkey, it's in Egypt. From what I understand, it's in Machu Picchu and places in Peru. It's at Easter Island. All the obvious sites that you would go to experience, ancient monuments, are being shut off. And the other reason for this is that they don't want you to take good photographs and videos, because they want to be the ones that release this information into the public domain. So, they really don't want you making YouTube videos about them. It's as simple as that. And this is happening more and more. So it really is important, if people are interested in this subject, to get out to these sites now, because as the years and the decades go on, more and more of them are going to be shut down. I mean, as far as any kind of conspiracy is concerned, I'm not sure. Obviously there's areas they don't want you to see certain things that are going on, but I tend to try and shy away from too much conspiracy theory, really.
Now, in regards to your newest book, which the subtitle does bring up brings up another topic that I want to get into, the Anunnaki. It's a lot of people don't know what the Anunnaki is. They hear that
No.
you hear people like, Joe Rogan's brought it up with Billy Carson,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Uncharted X talks about it. Other
Yeah.
YouTube channels will bring it up. For people who have heard the term but don't know what it's referring to, or what's the origin story of the Anunnaki and how it has a connection to
Yeah.
us. Can you get into that a little bit, please?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, let's say what most people believe the Anunnaki are first. And this is based on the books by a guy called Zecharia Sitchin. I think the first of which came out in the 1970s, which was the 12th planet. His idea of the Anunnaki is that they were space beings that came down in, flying saucers 500,000 years ago. They landed in South Africa, and either created or genetically manipulated the ape men, the hominin, as we'd call them, so that they were stronger, and they then set them to work in the mines to to get gold, which was then taken off planet to a place called Nibiru, which is a planet that is in our solar system, but it's got such an elliptical orbit that it only comes around every few thousand years. I don't know exactly how much. I think it could be about 3, I think. That's what he wrote, and this has become incredibly popular. I mean, he also claimed to have retranslated Sumerian texts, which is where the stories of the Anunnaki are found. Sumerian, Babylonian, Assyrian. So in other words, he pointed towards these translations and said, this is it. But here's the thing, he made them up. There's no question about that at all. I have this on good authority from his leading acolyte, who told me in confidence one day over a couple of drinks. He said that Zachariah himself told me he made them up. And when I say made them up, what I mean is that he reinterprets them in a way that he felt they should read. So for that reason, I have to assume that, that this idea of the space beings coming down is something which is not quite what the actual texts say. And what do the texts say? Well, they say, firstly, the term Anunnaki. That's a very late form of the name of these mythical beings. That comes from Babylonian texts. The original name for the Anunnaki was Anunna, the Anunna. And Anunna, which is spelled Anunnna, basically means, if you break it up into the proper cuneiform glyphs and vowels on whatever, it means something like those of the sky, or those that are possessed by the sky. Okay. And if you want to break that down into simplified form, it's the sky people, or the people of the sky. Now, obviously, followers of Zachariah Sitchin would say, well, there's your confirmation then, the sky people came down. But I think that it means people that had knowledge of the sky. In other words, an elite group, prime movers, who had knowledge of astronomy, alignments of the sky, possibly comets, and even what we would call astrology today. In other words, how to interpret the influence of the celestial bodies upon themselves, the environment around them, and the world as a whole. And these people, I think, were the prime movers behind places like Göbekli Tepe. The guy that discovered Göbekli Tepe was named Klaus Schmidt. Really forward-thinking German archaeologist. I met him. Unfortunately, he's no longer with us. And he wrote a book that was published in 2012, which was brilliant, all about Göbekli Tepe. And in this, he actually says that he believed that the huge T-pillars, particularly the ones at the centers of the enclosure, were basically memorializing the founders of this culture, the Tez-Tepela culture, and that they were the Anunna, and that quite clearly, that the people that followed them built these enclosures and still wanted to have contact with them, just in the same way that, we would want to retain links with our own departed by keeping artifacts and objects from them or whatever. And I think that he was spot on. He was absolutely spot on. So who were these people? Who were they? Well, at Karahantepe last year, they uncovered this massive new enclosure. I mean, it could be as much as 100 feet across, could be the largest one. And it's got this altar, it's got this porthole stone with a circle in it. It's got this vulture right by the side of it that's right on the edge of the vulture on the altar. And next to that was this massive statue that is sitting down. The way they've made it is that it's sitting down on a bench which other people could sit down on. But he was sitting down on this bench, and he's 7.5 feet tall, and that's sitting down. So if this guy got up, he'd be at least 9 feet. He's clearly a giant. And what we know is that there's a lot of myths and legends suggesting that the prime movers behind all of this were either extremely tall or what we would call giants. So who are these giants? Well, archaeologists now are looking towards the area of Siberia and Mongolia, which is far to the east of modern-day Turkey, as the point of origin of the peoples that would eventually come to create Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. And this is the same area that there's a distant cousin of ours that existed right the way through till about 30 to 40,000 years ago, called the Denisovans, their main site being the Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. And what we know about them is that they were incredibly sophisticated as early as 45 to 55,000 years ago. For instance, look up the Denisovan bracelet. I mean, it's this beautiful greenstone bangle. It could be made today, and it's got a hole through it so that you could hang something from it. And that hole has a feed rate for a drill that's comparable to a modern day drill. I mean, they've studied it. This is an academic paper. It's not some new age site. It's an academic paper says this. So how are they able to drill these holes so easily? They also created the first bone needles, which were used clearly for tailored clothing. They also created the first musical instruments in the form of whistles and flutes. They also possibly rode horses. I mean, because horse DNA has been found in the Denisova cave, and it has been suggested that they domesticated and therefore probably even rode horses. They were the first people to study the movement of the stars, the sun and the moon, and we know this because an artifact was found in the cave that has 72 notches on it in certain sequences that very clearly relate to the movement of the sun and the moon. So they were the people that first started all this sort of stuff to do with the following the movement of the sun and the moon. And on top of this, they created a stone tool technology that gradually then moves from there all the way into Southwest Asia and eventually turns up in Anatolia just in time for the creation of the Tash Tepelah movement. So, I have written this in my books. It's in the latest book as well. But the archaeologists are also coming round to this same way of thinking, that there's a huge influence from peoples coming in from as far east as Mongolia and Siberia, and they were carrying with them possibly the legacy of the Denisovans with them. So that's the way I start to look at things. I mean, I'm not, even though I appear regularly on Ancient Aliens, my ideas of the possible contact with either extraterrestrials, transdimensional beings or parallel worlds is slightly different. I think that a lot of it goes on up here. In other words, through what we call quantum entanglement. This is the idea that particles, no matter how far away they go, can have instant communication with each other. And if a whole load of those particles are in my head, that their twins could be in somebody else's head. And if they're both doing the same dance, that's the transfer of information, what you would call telepathy or mind over matter. And this is going all the time. We're all communicating with each other, but we just block it out. And thank God we do, because we just go mad. But this is what telepathy, it's what precognition is all about. Mind over matter, spells, prayers, everything can be explained if you start looking at quantum entanglement, which is a scientific thing. I mean, it's been talked about since the time of Einstein. I mean, he wrote it. He was the first person that really wrote about it, actually trying to put it down, saying that, if it exists, then we have to throw away the textbooks basically and start again. So it must be wrong. But no, we now know absolutely that quantum entanglement is real, and it's even being used in the first quantum computers, which are, being perfected right at this minute. So, the idea of communication with higher intelligences doesn't need to be face to face. And in fact, if we have knowledge of quantum entanglement today, the chances are that higher intelligences knew about it thousands of years ago, if not millions or even billions of years ago. So, the idea of communicating across huge distance, planet to planet, galaxy to galaxy, instantaneously, let's point this out because it happens outside of normal space time, then I think that we could easily, our whole evolution could be influenced by higher intelligences. They don't need to visit this place in flying saucers. Having said that, I'm a believer in UFOs, UAP, flying saucers. Um, I've written about it for the past 40, 50 years. So, no problems there. But I think that we're dealing with something far more exotic than simply a spacecraft coming from planet A to planet B and coming down and landing. That's too naive. It's too Star Trek. We're dealing with something far more exotic, which I think people should start really trying to get to grips with.
Yeah, so with like angels and demons and when people think they see spirits, like do you think that could be other dimensional? Like how much of your research has changed your worldview? Like the way, the nature of reality, like you were saying before, I think a lot of times we assume because of our limited understanding of the way things work, we assume like, hey, there must be some flying thing that takes a physical alien to this physical other planet and everything's physical, even though we like we've talked about, Rupert Sheldrake and all these other perspectives and thinkers and philosophers who expand on all these unexplained things and energy and vibration, frequency, and all these other things. Like, how much of your research has changed drastically, your worldview, and what is your worldview now? Do you think there are other dimensions? Do you when you hear stories of UFOs or abductions or connecting or contacting some other beings? What do you think that is?
Well, it's all of it is real in some capacity, but I suppose let's go back to the building blocks of the universe itself. I think it's you ask how my views of changed. Well, I don't think that, yes, they have changed, but I think it's more a case of evolution than change. In other words, every year I'm on this planet, I learn new things and I can put another piece of the jigsaw into this picture that's very gradually emerging. And let's go back to the beginning of the universe. Why not? I mean, the theories of what we call string theory really took a turn in the mid 1990s, because at that time there were about five different versions of string theory. They all suggested that there was some kind of subatomic, particle, although I hesitate to use that word, which they called a string that was like behind all other, you know, more obvious particles like electrons and photons and stuff like this. And it wasn't going anywhere because there were too many rival theories. They were also looking at the idea that it only really worked if you invoked 10 dimensions. But then a very clever guy came along by the name of Ed Witten. And what he did was to look at all of these theories and realized that if you just added one further dimension to make 11 in total, they all were part of the same theory. So he created this hybrid string theory, which basically goes like this: that before our universe came into existence, there was an 11-dimensional realm. He referred to it and his colleagues as the bulk, B-U-L-K, the bulk, and that into this bulk could manifest coming in from somewhere else, and we can talk about that somewhere else in a minute, something that would expand out almost like a bubble to create what they referred to as a brane, B-R-A-N-E. And this brane would create a universe, one like our own, that would have its own laws of physics. And of course, our laws of physics are that we have 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. But because we are expanding within this 11-dimensional world, the other dimensions, what that, hold on, there's 4, so that left. The other 7, bearing in mind that obviously, was it 4 plus 7? Yeah, the other 7 would still be there, but they would be what they refer to as compactified. In other words, so small and out the way that we wouldn't really even be aware of their existence. we would live in that world. We'd be three-dimensional creatures. But what he said was that other brains could come into existence within the bulk, and they would have their own laws of physics. They could be 4 dimensions of space and 2 dimensions of time, or something even more exotic, and that these different brains could buck up to each other. They could either touch each other or perhaps even overlap, and that if they overlapped, one could bleed into the other. And that is incredibly important, because what that means is that you might be able to interact and overlap with another brain where there is higher dimensional activity going on all the time. And the result of that is we'd see something that was happening. We might see mysterious lights, weird beings, energies, whatever, shifts in reality, but we wouldn't quite be able to understand what was going on, because we ourselves are three-dimensional creatures. It's a little bit like the whole concept of flatland. This was something which, was written about in a book at the beginning of the 20th century, and people like Carl Sagan, the great cosmologist, used it as an example of how we relate to realities. Is that if we're three-dimensional, what if there was people that were two-dimensional? They lived in a two-dimensional world, and so everything was flat. They were flat, their world was flat, everything. And something like a ball, 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 comes through their world. What would they see? They'd see like something that was gradually expanding out as a circle until it reached a maximum diameter as that ball was passing through their world, and then it would close again to nothing. And so they wouldn't see the ball. All they would see is this circle opening and then closing. Now, so in other words, they'd never have the concept of a ball. They'd never have the concept of a sphere. All they know was something weird was going on, basically, and they could interpret it using their own system of measurement or understanding of science or whatever. Now, think of us as three-dimensional. If a four-dimensional interaction takes place, we're going to see something, but we're not going to fully be able to pin down what it is that's taking place. And that's what would happen if two different brains coexisted and overlapped. And the thing is that if they overlap, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're always going to be overlapped. They could overlap for a couple of days and then go their own ways if they're moving within the bulk. So in other words, for a couple of days or maybe a couple of weeks or something, you would have all strange things, cryptids from parallel worlds, weird UFOs and lights and strange beings and dogmen and whatever else appearing. And then suddenly, bang, it's gone again. And everything goes quiet once more. Now, this to me is a very good way of looking at how we can perceive weird stuff going on in our own physical reality. And I think that, that Ed Witten, with his 11-dimensional concept of these brain worlds, really hit the nail on the head, in my opinion. So, yeah, my world has changed because I understand that around us could be 11 dimensions, not just four, 3 of space, 1 of time. And what's so interesting is that in Switzerland, these people have been trying to work out how to take consciousness out of a brain, put it in a computer and store it there so that they can put it in AI or somebody else's brain or whatever. They're known as the Blue Brain Project. I mean, you can look them up. And a few years ago, they announced that they'd worked out that the way consciousness relates to the brain is not on 3 or 4 dimensions, but on 11 dimensions. We are hardwired to work in 11 dimensions. So even though these other higher dimensions are compactified, we're still hardwired to connect with them. And I find that interesting because is it possible then that we get a glimpse of them either in dreams or in visions, or perhaps in altered states of consciousness, perhaps, when we take hallucinogens, not that obviously I condone that on air. So is it possible that we do get glimpses of higher dimensional realms and exactly what's going on within them, within this type of state, because our brains are hardwired to work in 11 dimensions?
Yeah, there's always been speculation about where we get our ideas, right? And sometimes you hear people who are musicians or comedians or, anybody who does anything creative talk about how they seem like the idea came to them, right? Like it almost wasn't their own, like they were tapping into something. And sometimes I think about like, the idea of radio frequencies, right? If I don't have an antenna, how would I know they existed? We're so limited with our senses, like we like to assume everything we feel, see, and hear is the only thing that exists around us. But obviously, there could be plenty of things around us that we just can't see, hear, or feel. And so it's like if I was born without a nose, how would somebody explain scent to me, right? I'd be like, what is this thing you're talking about? I don't experience it. Uh, so when we look at these ancient civilizations and their knowledge of the universe, do you think it was tapping into something, like they had some understanding of how to tap into some information, something? Because you don't tend to I guess subscribe to the idea that it was given to us from some aliens from another planet, right? It's you think there's something else. What is that something else? Where do you think they did get this information that helped them build these ancient sites that for many people are still unexplained on how they did it?
Yeah. Well, I think either you believe or you don't believe that there are higher intelligences. I happen to believe that there are. But here is the honest fact: we do not know what they are. They they could be, and I would favour the idea that they are multidimensional, transdimensional beings that exist within the bulk all the time, and that through certain mediums, particularly that of plasma. Plasma is the full state of matter. It exists within the sun, within stars, within neutron stars, black holes around the edge of them. In fact, it's suggested that plasma probably makes up as much as 90% of the universe. Um, and basically, plasma is where atoms split apart into their components, and the electrons are allowed to do their own thing, form their own forms within self-created magnetic fields. And they go, suddenly you've got a ball of light in front of you, basically. And these balls of light we would interpret in terms of UFOs or UAP. They can be intelligent, sentient. They can take on more physical forms. They can also be used as portals, for more physical craft to actually come out of. I mean, this has been witnessed on many occasions. So there is an intelligence, but to me, that those balls of light, and when I say balls, we're not just talking about tiny little balls. I mean, we can talking about something that could be 100 yards across, is that they are intelligences in their own right. They are manifesting within our realm. We are perceiving them in this form. Sometimes they will individualize into beings, entities that we can see. We would see them in terms of aliens or greys or whatever. And they can interact with us. But what are they really? Are they extraterrestrials, or are we dealing with a type of intelligence that is beyond our comprehension? And I think that the answer is yes. And when I say comprehension, what I mean by that is that we can't fully identify them. And also, they're interacting with us through quantum entanglement. In other words, they are able, our brains, everything about us works through electricity, basically. Firing of neurons in the brains, in the body, the nervous system, everything. That's why we take electrolytes, basically, to keep all those functions going. And because of this, if they're made of electrons and we have electrons being fired around our body all the time, they can be entangled. They can be entangled within our body, within our heads. So we can resonate one-to-one with these intelligences. We can feel them. We can connect with them. We can receive information from them. But we still don't know exactly who they are. And they may well be appearing to us in a way which is acceptable to our cultural upbringing. And I say this because obviously in the last 70, 80 years, when people, come across entities, they generally say they come from another planet or they are wearing space suits or something like this. But before this time, the same type of phenomena was occurring, but it was connected with the fairies. You'd have fairy abductions. I mean, people would come across a field, see this ball of light. They would walk up to it, and as they were coming up to it, suddenly they'd see fairies dancing inside it. They'd go up, they would enter in almost like through a door. They'd dance with the fairies and, maybe even eat what the fairies, offer them. And they come out of that ball of light and time is missing. Just like the missing time in an abduction. But according to many fairy accounts, it's not just a few hours or a couple of days that go missing. A year can go missing, or in some accounts, 100 years. And when the people come out, everybody that they knew is dead. Now, okay, let's look at the possibility a lot of this is exaggeration, but the concept is the same. The idea of an object, an object of light that then takes some kind of more a hardened form that you interact with the entities, and and you lose time. That's exactly what alien abductions are all about. When you have an onboard experience, you're being absorbed into that environment for for a type of experience where you'd be medically examined or shown around the ship and told the world's going wrong, please change your ways, all the rest of it. It's the same type of thing, but it's just modernized. And you look how different flying saucers have changed since the 1940s and 1950s. When these early contactees like George Adamski and George Van Tassel, were claiming to encounter objects that, that had levers and gears inside them, and space beings that look like something out of a science fiction magazine. And then how it gradually shifts into the 60s when you have abductions like Betty and Barney Hill, to others in the 70s where their craft are now becoming much more ergonomic, and things are much more high tech, through to the modern day where the interaction is in many cases much more pure light as far as what's going on. Now, are we saying that these space beings have changed so much in 70, 80 years, or is it just our idea of science fiction is changing with it, so that what we expect to see is being read through our minds by these intelligences to create an environment which is acceptable to us as to what's going on? Another example of this is that in the past, when people encountered these balls of light very close up, they would suddenly find themselves in front of Jesus. Jesus would suddenly be standing in front of them saying, "Come with me to the kingdom of heaven." And suddenly they'd find themselves flying around with Jesus, in this ball of light, looking down at paradise or something like this. This is true stories of people that encounter this type of phenomena in the past, that they're either their cultural or religious background decides what the type of encounter that they actually have. So, I think it's important to be aware of this, but I think that, we have to, if we do encounter phenomena like this, and, it's just weird, obviously we started talking about Kara Hantepe and we're talking about all this now, but, be aware that these intelligences are almost beyond understanding. And if you accept that, but still connect with them, then, go for the ride, basically. But, it can be quite traumatic, let's say.
Well, there is a connection between all these topics, because I think some of these ancient civilizations seem to have, like, they were believers, for lack of a better term, of something else greater than physical. You know, when doing your research, do you think that it's possible that some of them did have the knowledge or understanding of these dimensions and how to interact with, other maybe living or, spiritual beings somewhere else? Because they, the part of the story with a lot of these ancient civilizations that we still can't come to grasp with is, like, where do they get this knowledge? Was it organically a progression? And, was it a progression that eventually something happened and then that civilization was lost, but maybe not all the knowledge and information was lost, and a new civilization kind of gathered or kept some of that information? Or were they tapping into other dimensions, other beings, and gathering some understanding of the universe from that? Like, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, all of it is to do with the state of mind, isn't it? I mean, yes, people are passing on a legacy from one generation to the next, of all that they have learned. Obviously, their own ancestors have learned, but it's also techniques. It's techniques of gaining information. I mean, at Karahan Tepe, for instance, they're focusing on the galactic bulge. Now, the galactic bulge coincides with the center of our own Milky Way galaxy. And what do we know is at the center of our galaxy, but a supermassive black hole called Sagittarius A star. And obviously, one of your esteemed guests that you had on there, Rupert Sheldrake, he basically has proposed in a paper that supermassive black hole is intelligent. It's an entity in its own right. And that, that if that is the case, then it's looking after its own. In other words, the galaxy, the matter that it's spewed out has created. And that we are a part of that. And in many ways, you can look at that supermassive black hole as almost like a sort of either a god in its own right, or as almost like a portal into higher dimensional consciousness. And if these people at Karahan were attuning to this, is it possible that they themselves were connected with this entity and that this was giving them information? It was allowing them to update their technologies, their innovations, their religious ideas, their cosmological notions of the universe, how it came into being, who we are, so-called ontological ideas of, who we are, why are we here, and where do we come from? Do you know what I mean? I mean, all of these are the sort of questions that we want answered today. And also, of course, what happens at the point of death? Do we survive? And I think that this is the sort of information that they would be getting, but not all at once. What they had is the techniques on how to get this information. And I think that this involved rituals where they were going into altered states of consciousness. Yes, almost certainly hallucinogens were involved. And they were concentrating on that very specific area of the sky, which represented the head of the Milky Way serpent, the cosmic serpent. And they believed that they were communicating with that serpent, not just, on a sort of one-to-one basis, but that they allowed themselves to become that serpent, that, they allowed that serpent to enter inside them so that that information could come out through their mouths in a way which we would virtually call possession today, and that they would be speaking in tongues, literally, to attendants that would be listening and recording in some manner that information as it came out. I mean, today, there are cults where people are still possessed by snakes. In Thailand, for instance, in Haiti, people become possessed by a god in the form of a snake and begin to writhe around on the ground, slithering about as if they're snakes themselves, talking in tongues. I think it probably goes on in certain Baptist churches, in North America to this day, I would presume. But beyond this is that, this information is accessible to whoever wants, but you need a certain mindset. Now, could I do that? Maybe. If I go into an altered state, then, maybe I can draw information because of entanglement. We talk about entanglement. I said to you that this is something that's not just happening between a few people. It's there between everybody. And because the way that entanglement works is outside of normal space-time, it's existing within this bulk which we talked about. In other words, the communication is going on outside of normal space-time of the three dimensions of space and one of time. So that's why it's instantaneous. I mean, scientists to this day cannot get their head round how or why it's instantaneous. It's because it exists outside of anywhere that needs to move through what they call, local space or localization. It is what's known as non-local communications outside of everything else. In other words, it doesn't go through the air from one place to the other and take time. It's instant, absolutely instant. But if all of us are entangled, it's what I like to call the entanglement of all, or the mind of God. The mind of God, not God himself, the mind of God, i.e., all thoughts, not just of the here and now, but of the past, the present, the future, or certainly from a linear perspective in the future, is that we have potential access to that. Now, I'm a writer, I write books. And sometimes I see the cover, I see the title of a book, I see the contents of a book even before I've written it down. It's almost like the book itself has already been written by me in the future, and all I need to do is just latch onto it and write it. Now, I'm not saying it won't, change or vary, or publishers might say we're not having that cover, we want something else. But it's almost like somewhere out there in one linear possibility of the future, I've already written that book, and that's what I'm heading towards doing, is completing that book. And and that's a premonition, that's precognition. And I think that this goes on an awful lot more than what we realize. I mean, in the past, people talked about, kings or princes or princesses or whatever having their own fate, that they were going to become a hero. They were going to do things that, and they were born to do it. People would know that they were going to do it from a baby, and they would gradually go on that hero's journey, and eventually they would achieve whatever it was that had been prophesied. It's there in Greek myth, it's there in myths in Norse tradition, it's there, I'm sure, in many other traditions around the world. And that's the same thing. Is these people had this knowledge of entanglement, and how all of the past, present, and the future coexist with each other. The past still exists. In my opinion, a lot of when people say they see ghosts, they're not necessarily just seeing a replay of a tape that's just being turned on and off. They're actually glimpsing through a veil into the past. So they're seeing somebody make that same movement again and again and again. On that same day, on that same day, they're glimpsing the same thing happening, because it's still taking place to this very moment and will continue to do so. And quite clearly, the stronger the emotion associated with it, the more it will remain in existence, and the more, therefore, it will become accessible to mental sympathy. In other words, mental attunement.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And even when we go to wakes or funerals, there's always something about, like, people try to understand what is the soul, what is consciousness. And when it's like there are things that we all kind of agree exist, but we can't verbalize or describe it in a way that we're like we can truly understand, like, what is this thing that we all kind of agree is there, it exists, but what actually is it? And when you go to a wake and you see, or at least from my personal experience, when I see a body lifeless there, it actually does look lifeless. Like it looks like there's a lack of connection to that body for me, because it's like that person that I loved, whatever was there, the soul, it's gone. Now all I see is like flesh and bones and this physical material thing. But the thing I loved, like, isn't there anymore. Like it doesn't seem, and if the soul didn't exist, if there wasn't something more, then I'm not sure I would have that disconnect to, something that is physically and was physically somebody I adored and loved. But when I see them lifeless, it's almost like, okay, like almost like the life has left the body, the soul has left the body. And again, these are all kind of topics that kind of all intertwine, because it's like, well, where did it go? What is it? What is this this realm, this dimension that we're living in? Is there other dimensions? When we see spirits, when we see, my parents are very, they come from up north in Portugal, and they're very like spiritual, religious type of people. They're farmers, and they would always tell these stories. You would hear these stories of a aunt that saw their husband's spirit, after he passed away, or this person having this spell put on them or whatever, and having this weird thing happen to them. And I kind of just dismissed it all. And as I get older, I'm starting to think like maybe they don't know what's going on. Maybe they don't have a logical explanation to what these experiences were. But maybe these experiences were real. Maybe these things did happen. And just because we don't know what actually happened doesn't mean they didn't happen.
Well, I mean, firstly, I'm sure they were real experiences, that your folk had. The question becomes how much of them are imagination and how much of them do relate to a genuine connection with the outside. In other words, beyond their own individual minds, with this, entanglement of all, as I call it. And I think the answer is to some degree. We don't know how much. I mean, I work with psychics. I mean, my best friends are psychics. They don't advertise it. They're not stage mediums. They're not spiritualists. They just happen to have an incredible ability, and they can pick up names, dates, and places when we go to sites or when we do meditations easily, very easily. And these will check out. They are not 100% accurate. No psychic ever is. I mean, the best that they can be on any one occasion is perhaps 90% accurate. And what I mean by that is that, let's say they make 10 statements, 9 of them are going to be correct. But that's incredibly unusual. Most psychics are probably no more than 50% accurate. Some are as little as 30% accurate. And if you get, below, let's say 20, that's just chance ultimately. So these people are able to connect outside of their own heads with something. This is not information that's down in their deep subconscious that they're just bubbling up to the surface just because they're doing meditations or whatever. This is very clearly information that's coming in from the outside. Where's it coming from? How is it coming to them? Sometimes I think they're just connecting with the site and the site's just speaking to them. But on other occasions, it feels like something deliberately wants information to be downloaded into your head and for it to come out now at this moment. And it feels different. And it feels like there is some kind of intelligence ensuring that information comes through. I know that's a subjective way of looking at things, but it does seem that way. And again, I put to you that we don't fully comprehend what these intelligences are. Can we see them as our ancestors, a dead grandmother or whatever, or father or whatever? Can we see them as extraterrestrial? Can we see them as transdimensional? Maybe, but it is possible that these are simply masks that a much higher intelligence is using so that we are accepting this information, and that it's coming from something that is incomprehensible to us. I mean, it may just be pure energy, an intelligence that is pure energy that has no form, but it knows that we would find that difficult to accept. Therefore, it deliberately takes on an identity so that it becomes more familiar for us for that information to be, to be accepted, understood, and processed.
Yeah, are you familiar with Dr. Tom Cowan? He has some interesting takes on I've had him on a few times throughout the years, and he has a theory, I think it's called like the DNA water theory, and he goes into just how we like to look at all physical material things as non-intelligent, like what we see is what we get type of philosophy. And he tends to believe that everything has some type of memory or intelligence. And he goes into like some of the experiments they've done with water, where they've played different types of music, and the way, based on the type of music that you play, it'll crystallize in different shapes and images and all these weird things, and how and so it's again like all these things I feel like, and that's why I love your metaphor, because it's one that I've used before. on the show. Like all these things, I feel like are just pieces to the puzzle, and maybe we don't know how they connect or what image we're trying to see. But as we gather these pieces and we put them together, we hope that we can get at least a better understanding of what image that puzzle is, and that's on that puzzle. And so I do think like all these things are connected, the everything from the origin of man to understanding consciousness and spirit realm and all these things. I feel like there's just like there's some puzzle pieces that are missing. And, if we gather enough of them, then, maybe, we'll start connecting these dots and understanding reality. Because I mean, I guess that's kind of like the essence of what we're trying to do is like trying to understand kind of like our own origin story and understanding, what is the realm of reality? What are we living in? What are we experiencing? And again, these are questions. Speaking of ancient civilizations, these are questions that people have asked for forever since the beginning of time, and pondered on since the beginning of time, and so I think that's kind of what's fascinating. And I also think that's probably why a lot of people are getting uh, interested in this topic, because I think a lot of us have been told a origin story of man, a origin story of civilization, but maybe deep inside we've always had these questions of like, well, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And there's things that they're not accounting for, and there's things that they can't explain. So, you know, it makes people kind of, start to explore these other theories and these other explanations, and I think that's what makes it so fascinating, because I think we don't know, and there are a lot of questions, and there's but it does, again, I know you don't like to be conspiratorial. I don't mind being a little conspiratorial, because I think history is full of conspiracies. I'm always curious if like maybe you hear these stories of like the burning Library of Alexander. You hear about like secret hidden documents of the Vatican. You hear about all these things that kind of make you think about or the Knights Templar and like or the Freemasons, and like we're pondering on all these theories, and maybe we don't understand. But I wonder if somebody out there has more of those missing pieces, and maybe are suppressing it.
Probably. I mean, obviously, the first thing that you think of is, the Vatican. I mean, they've got this vast library down there, which, I mean, could contain anything. I mean, hopefully one day an institution like that will say, right, look, we're going to digitize everything we've got and make it available to the general public. But something tells me they're not, because there are going to be an awful lot of sensitive manuscripts that contain elements of religion, particularly, let's say, the Christian Gnostic religion, that go against the principles of Catholicism. And yeah, these are going to essentially go like this. That basically they're going to say that you don't need priests to connect with God. You can connect with the divine directly, and all you need to do is to do certain ceremonies or do certain meditations, visualize certain entities or symbols or something. I mean, and that would not benefit the Catholic Church, because as far as they're concerned, the only way that you can connect with God is through a priest of the apostolic succession. Or if you want to get close to him on a supernatural level, contact the Virgin Mary. Find a local statue of her in your church and speak your prayers to her. You can't contact Jesus directly. You certainly can't connect with God the Father directly. So that alone tells you that they're going to be hiding information and quite literally suppressing it. So yes, in a way, we are dealing with conspiracy theories. As far as institutions, military, government, stuff like that, yeah, I mean, they're going to have knowledge that would be useful to us, whether that relates to, contact with extraterrestrials, or encounters that we've had with, craft, or whether it be knowledge to do with archaeology that's been suppressed, and that was known about by things like the Smithsonian, Institute. but particularly to do with giants and giant bones, which we know they had probably by the thousands in the past, and are now all missing, although not necessarily because they've destroyed them, but because they've had to give them back, as far as the NAGPRA law that came into force around 1990, where all Native American bones and also any artifact that was found at a burial site has to be repatriated. And this is a process that's been going on from that point to today. I mean, that, you know, a lot of museums in America that had Native American artifacts are all now closing down. I don't know if you knew this. And all those artifacts that they had have gone. They've all been repatriated. And you know, some of them are just basically, they dig a huge great hole and they just bury them, basically. And these are priceless objects which could tell us so much about the past and what the ancients knew and what they believed in, whatever. And now they're gone forever. And this is something that I suspect is only going to get worse in different parts of the world. That, you know, we're going to be forced to repatriate everything, you know, as I say, not just bones, which is in many ways understandable, but artifacts as well. But, you know, it's like, if you've got an artifact that's 4,000 years old, then who do you go to repatriate it? I mean, you know, the local tribe will say, yeah, well, okay, this is obviously done by one of our ancestors, but we're not quite sure who, but thank you very much. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I understand why this is happening, but in a way, it's not helpful to science, and it's not helpful for us to understand fully our past.
Yeah, without a doubt. And that's why people like yourself are so necessary, because you, like I said in the beginning of the show, I think you being a journalist and not being somebody who grew up in this field, and it was more just your curiosity that took you here, you'll go into it with a much more open mind, and you'll be much more likely to explore different ideas and theories and whatnot. And I think that's what we need. And you know, anybody who kind of goes against the grain when there's a establishment of ideas that everybody accepts, you go against that. Typically, you're not treated very well. You know, I remember years ago having Gerard Williams on my show, who wrote the book The Escape of Adolf Hitler, and having a bunch of my World War II history buff friends being like, "That's ridiculous. How, you know, there's no way Hitler made it, you know, to Argentina and all this stuff." And then, you know, you're just, it was just amazing how they all just accepted this status quo because it was just repeated. It was like Joseph Goebbels used to say, you know, if you repeat a lie enough times, it becomes true. And that's the thing about history. A lot of things just get accepted. Nobody goes against it. And then you can only build on those ideas. They're not very open to new ideas and new perspectives. And that's why I think somebody like Graham Hancock gets so much backlash, because he's not a establishment guy. You know, he comes from a journalist and background, and he was just somebody who's curious. So it's like, you're not a part of their clique, you're not a part of their group. So you're, you know, so they push back, and you're also now questioning things that they've, or at least getting people to question things that they think they've already come to conclusions with, you know. So yeah, it becomes becomes an issue. But your books, your research, it's very necessary, and I'm glad that the world has people like yourself who aren't afraid to explore these ideas and ask questions. And yeah, I can't thank you enough for coming on. For listeners who might not be familiar with your work, where's the best place to get your books? If it's your website, if it's Amazon, if it doesn't matter, I guess you let them know. And also any social media accounts that you might be, or social media platforms you might have accounts on. And then any other exciting things that you might want to promote, please do.
Sure. Yeah. Well, andrewcollins.com is where you'll find everything. So it's just my name, andrewcollins.com. And on there's some great articles about all the subjects that we're talking about. You can just click through on videos, obviously, that you can watch. And we do tours, you know, to some exciting places, which are basically voyages of discovery. We go to oh, sorry, you just put it up there, right? What was going on? Yeah. We go to Turkey twice a year. Yeah, just click the image, it will go through in theory. Hopefully, anyway. Right, you go. Um, and we go to Turkey. We're going to Peru, Bolivia, and Easter Island next November. And we did conferences and everything. Yeah, I mean, if you want my books, there you go. That's the latest one. Karahan Tepe, Civilization of the Anunnaki and the Cosmic Origins of the Serpent of Eden. Graham Hancock's given me a nice little quote there. I was all through the month on his site for October. And yeah, I mean, there's not just that. I mean, a lot of the subjects we're talking about today, you can find in my book Origins of the Gods, which I did with my good friend and colleague Gregory Little. Also been working on Stonehenge. You can see coming up here. Lots of new discoveries coming out there. The idea that it may be a sonic temple, maybe a model of the universe, and other weird stuff towards the bottom of the page there. So you just click through. There's loads of stuff. There's dozens and dozens of pages. It's like a labyrinth there. I mean, bearing in mind that it was originally created, I think, in the mid 1990s, and there's sort of literally hundreds of different pages, so you can get lost in it for hours if you really want to.
Yeah, definitely. I'll put the links in the show description. So please, people, check out his books, check out his work. I'll send you links to the show once it's up and live, and then feel free to post it, share it anywhere you want. All my stuff's open source. I just try to get these conversations out there. I don't really care who gets the clicks. And thank you so much for staying up late, because I know you're in the UK, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, but no, I mean, I've got a whole evening ahead of myself, so don't worry about that.
great, great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time. Let's talk again in the near future, Andrew, and
Sure,
keep up the amazing work. I really appreciate it.
sure. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Ciao. Take care.